Greetings, I'm Guinevere Catchings-Hess, president of the Black Women's Agenda. And like all of you, I am the change. I matter. I vote. So on behalf of the Black Women's Agenda Board of Directors, welcome to this year's symposium, I Matter and I Vote. Because we know when Black people vote, we impact policy. Why do you think for generations, misguided people have worked so hard to keep us from exercising our rights? It was because our votes mattered. And why do you think right now, in 2020, some officials are closing polling places, purging voter rolls, and moving mailboxes? It's because our votes matter. You matter. And in just a few short weeks, we have an extraordinary opportunity to impact this election. But we have to be smart about this and the attempts to manipulate us. You've heard the terms misinformation and disinformation. You can call it what you want. You can put a white collar on it, a tie, and dress it up, but in the small town that I grew up, they're just lies. We know for a fact that the Black communities are being targeted. We cannot let Russians or anyone else that is not acting in our best interests keep us from voting. Get your information from trusted sources. Now more than ever, voting is not only our right, it's our power. On November 3rd, we must vow to be powerful. Those of you who attended last year's Symposium Town Hall will remember that we initiated a conversation about voter suppression. Well, today we will continue that dialogue this afternoon with the esteemed moderator, Heather McGhee, and a panel that is just bar none the best to help us explore strategies and combating voter suppression, registering and engaging African-American voters, and ensuring that Blacks have the opportunity to make our voices heard. I have to tell you, I was over the moon when Heather McGhee decided that she would accept BWA's invitation to moderate this symposium today. Heather is an influential voice in the media, and her tone and demeanor, and she speaks with facts. It's so empowering. Heather designs and promotes solutions to inequities in America. She has an upcoming book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. It's now available for pre-order, and her 2020 TED Talk, Racism Has a Cost for Everyone, reached 1 million views in just 2 months online. Heather, I want you to know that I am a force multiplier. I sent that TED link to all the members of the board. And also, I want to let you know that I am using that link as a topic of conversation for my next multicultural virtual happy hour, because it's so thought-provoking. Thank you for leading this panel. Unfortunately, the unflappable Yamiche L. Cinder from PBS cannot be here today because of a family emergency, but we are wishing she and her family well. Dr. Reverend Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, is here. This summer, Reverend Barber led a national call for moral revival, something that's needed more of today, a moral compass for us to do the right thing for the right reasons. Dr. Barber, you are a leader of the moral movement to combat racial and economic inequalities. Thank you for rekindling the civil rights movement of my youth. Whenever I participate in one of your initiatives, I find myself humming old freedom songs. You help us reimagine the possibilities of what we can be. And joining us a little bit later will be my sister friend, Dr. Johnetta B, who is an accomplished educator and museum professional, noted speaker, and author on issues of diversity and equity. She is currently the national chair of the seventh president of the National Council of Negro Women. Dr. Cole is a quintessential, phenomenal Black woman. And I will always be in debt for her for taking my almost midnight call and agreeing to be on the panel. And then there's my not so secret heartthrob, Princeton's professor, Dr. Glaude Jr, author, commentator, and chair of Princeton University's Department of African American Studies. I share my admiration with Dr. Cornel West, who has titled him the towering intellectual of his generation. Dr. Glaude offers critical insights to the problems facing Black America. Now, we want Dr. Glaude to experience an uptick in book sales immediately following this town hall because we want him to come back. And Aisha C. Mills, we are absolutely thrilled to have you, the social justice warrior who makes sure that democracy works for everyone. Ms. Mills knows how to bring tenacity and get results. And she is so dedicated to eliminating social, health, and economic disparities faced by the LGBTQ people of color. She was the first African-American woman to lead a national LGBTQ organization in her role as president, and the LGBTQ Victory Fund and Institute. So when I'm trying to wrap my head around just how fabulous this panel is, I remembered when I was a child and my mother would make a fabulous dinner, and afterwards she would say, the Queen of England could not have had a dinner finer than this one. And I would say to myself, how does she know that sitting at this table in Camilla, Georgia? But now I understand. The Queen of England could not have a better panel than this. So with that, I will turn the town hall to our esteemed royal panel. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Gwen. Certainly the Queen could not get us to this table if she doesn't treat Duchess Meghan better, I'll tell you that. So this is really an incredible group, and it really is a testament to you, Gwen, and to your leadership, and to just how important the Black women's agenda is to this country right now, and to the hundreds of people who are on the Zoom and thousands who are watching online. I want to invite the good Reverend Dr. Barber to turn his video on so that we can all be seen for this conversation. And then also just remind folks that Dr. Cole is going to be joining us momentarily from the United Nations, or from the Zoom that she's doing with the United Nations in the exact same place. See, if this were pre-pandemic time, she would not be able to make it from one panel to the other in 10 seconds, but now she can. So we have a lot to talk about today, and I really want to get right into it. And I want to start with you, Dr. Glaude. You, like me, are asked, on a near daily basis to go on television, on the cable news, on MSNBC and NBC News, and make sense of this moment. And I have seen you do what I often do, which is try my best to elevate the conversation from the horse race, from interpreting Trump's tweets, from seeing our people as a monolith to be delivered to one party or another. For you right now, particularly on the conversation of what this movement moment means for politics and for our future, what do you think the media is missing? What is something we are not talking enough about that the people who are part of this conversation with Black Women's Agenda should be hearing about and thinking about and taking with them as they consume the rest of the deluge of cable news and media about this election?
Well, Heather, it's such a delight to be on a panel with you. I'm always excited because I learn so much every time I sit down with you and listen. It's delightful to be with Reverend Barber and Sister Mills and President Cole. She was the president of Spelman when I was at Morehouse, so I'm really excited about just seeing her again. I think what's missing in our conversation is, I think, a nuanced account of the collapse of a particular political and economic ideology that has governed our country for the last 40 years. We are witnessing in a very significant way the bankruptcy of, whether we want to call it neoliberalism, Reaganism, Thatcherism, or whatever we want to call it. And that bankruptcy is evidencing itself in increased precarity among those who are most vulnerable. It's evidencing itself in a deep divide between those who have and those who don't have. So we have the prospect of our first trillionaire in a moment when everyday ordinary people are struggling to keep their noses above water. We see that the carceral state is not sustainable in very clear ways, as this policy of law and order being tough on crime has led to increasing divisions and devastation in particular communities of color. And what we've seen very clearly is this, and I'll be very brief, is this real serious attack on the role of government in our lives. So for the last 40 years, we have been hearing that the federal government represents an intrusion on our liberty. It's a threat to freedom, that it poses nothing good outside of maintaining the national defense and ensuring the efficiency of the economy for investment bankers and making sure financialization, destroys the underpinnings of everyday ordinary workers, right? So it has been nothing but that attack for the last 40 years. And here we are facing a global pandemic that's devastating the country. And because we've had this attack on the very notion of the federal government, we have no national strategy. And what are we seeing, right? Devastation. Close to 200,000 people are dead, and we are dying at 2.5 times the rate of other populations. So I think what we're not getting at, because we're so focused on Donald Trump, Heather, we exceptionalize him, that we don't see the underlying ideology that has produced in so many ways a politics of death for the most vulnerable. And we need to get at that, I think, more clearly and more forcefully.
Thank you, Dr. Glaude. And I want to bring in on this point, just because I think you speak so powerfully to this as well. The good Reverend Dr. Barber, the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, the man who ignited a movement in North Carolina that was in many ways, with the Moral Mondays movement, a fusion movement, as you called it, that broke through the divides, particularly in the South, of the white Republicans and the Black Democrats, to bring people together on a moral vision of what is right and a foundational support for democracy. I would love to hear from you, Dr. Barber. What is this moment for the moral direction of our country? And particularly as we have seen the Black Lives Matter movement capture the imagination and, at least for now, the support of white Americans all over the country, what do you think is the promise of that multiracial movement that you, in many ways, were one of the early prophets of and organizers of? What is the direction now? Do we think that the multiracial movement for justice and a moral democracy is going to be able to get to the levels it needs to be, particularly in the American South, that it needs to be to change this country and to save this country.
Well, thank all of you so much, and I'm just honored to be with you. And let me say that Reverend, I almost said Reverend Dr. Glaude, and I talk almost every other day about necropolitics, the politics of death, and the fact that racism has always had a death measurement in all of its dispensations, and that moral fusion, Black and white people coming together across lines, is not a nuance. And we have to say that because the media will make us think it is. It's not. It was the hallmark of the abolition movement. It was the hallmark of the Reconstruction movement in the 1800s and later on in the 1960s. It was the hallmark of the Civil Rights movement. We too often misglorify that movement, and we talk about like John Lewis or Rosa Parks. And I'm not saying we shouldn't, God rest their souls, and they're tremendous, but we don't dig deep enough into the movement. There was a whole cadre of Black and white folk that worked in Montgomery before Rosa Parks sat down. There was a whole movement of Black and white and Jewish people. There was even a group called the Edmund Pettus Saints in Selma, who were white nuns who were engaged. So let me try to make some broad strokes. I may come back and be more specific that wrestle with that question. First of all, I think to even raise the issues of morality, we have to be careful not to say, okay, that's the feel-good thing to do, but does it work? The moral thing to do is the economic thing to do is the constitutional thing to do, right? That, for instance, economics used to not be a study unto itself. Economics was a form of moral philosophy. It was separated from moral philosophy because you can't be talking about morality and then have slavery rooted in evil economics. So we need to, some of the ways in which we talk has to be retrained. That's one thing that I think a moral movement does. It helps us retrain our tongue and retrain our imagination. Second thing is there are 5 interlocking injustices today that are going right at the heart of this democracy and have been with us. Systemic racism. And when I say systemic racism, let me be clear. I mean all of it. From not just police brutality, because I think that if we only identify Black death with police brutality, we leave a whole lot of dying unspoken to. And that means we let a lot of folk off the hook for killing us in a whole lot of other ways. Now, if it's a penetration point to open up a conversation about necropolitics, that's another question. And if we talk about racism, we got to deal with voter suppression. We have to deal with resegregation of our public schools and underfunding. We have to deal with mass incarceration. We have to deal with the missing injustice toward our Latino brothers and sisters. We can't leave that out of a conversation about race. We have to deal with the continuous mistreatment of the indigenous people, the First Nation people. We cannot leave that out of a real conversation about systemic racism. Then we have to deal with systemic poverty. And part of what we have to do there, two quick points, is we cannot allow this narrative, things got bad with COVID. For poor and low wealth people, things were bad before COVID. 700 people that were dying a day from poverty before COVID. 61% of all Black people were poor and low wealth before COVID. 140 million people were poor and low wealth before COVID. 43% of this nation was poor and low wealth before COVID. We had 62 million people working every day with less than a living wage before COVID. We had 54% of all African Americans making less than a living wage before COVID. So if we allow a narrative to say things got bad after COVID, then we actually undermine the ability to do a deep dive into this neoliberalism that has in fact created all of this extenuating pain. And then lastly, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy. We cannot have a serious conversation about wanting to transform things when we put 54 cents of every discretionary dollar into the war economy and less than 16 cents of every discretionary dollar into education, healthcare, and infrastructure. And then finally, the false moral narrative of religious nationalism and white evangelicalism. Frederick Douglass knew what we must know today. He said, I hate the religion of the slave master. He didn't say the Christianity of the slave master. He wouldn't call it that because it wasn't. And we have to understand how that religion of the slave master has had a metamorphosis down through the years. And we have to still hate. He said, but I love the Christianity of Jesus. We have to understand the dangers of religious nationalism that consecrates injustice. And so I would say that the moral focus forces us to open this up, have grown-up conversations and facing it, do it in communities that are very, very, very diverse, and it keeps us from just limiting it to a person or making an idol out of one enemy and thinking if you move that idol, then you've dealt with the enemy or you've dealt with the problem, which is in fact a way to only keep the problems alive and allow them to foster and fester even more.
Mm.
Mm.
Mm. Mm.
Both Reverend Barber and Dr. Glaude have talked about how Trump is a symptom and is one manifestation of a deeper ideological system, in the words of Eddie Glaude, and then of an evil and of a set of interlocking evils. Aisha, you have been a political strategist who has been guided by causes, right? The causes of equality and freedom for LGBTQ people, the causes of civil rights and equal rights, and the causes of feminism. And there is always, I think, this dance between how can we have the vehicle of electoral politics carry our dreams, our aspirations, our struggles for freedom. And for Black women, particularly, who have been the workhorses of electoral politics in so many races and communities, and certainly for the Democratic Party, there is this dance between pragmatism and idealism, between the vision that we have for our families and our understanding of what we need to do to get to 50+1 to have any kind of governing power. What do you think the Democratic Party owes to Black women? And what do you think are the most promising vehicles, and I don't just want to talk about the presidential right now, for a real transformation of our politics so that the dreams of Black women can be at the forefront? And I say that not because we just do the work, but we are also doing the work on behalf of the whole of America. And when we succeed and when the issues that impact us are finally resolved, our entire country will be able to thrive.
Well, first of all, I'm just so honored to be here with this esteemed panel. I am amening. I had to put myself on mute because I was literally amening as Dr. Glaude and as the good Reverend Barber were talking. And I'm so grateful that you set the context around real structural barriers and the history of this country and how we got where we are, because we are often inclined to think, and the Democrats often treat elections as if they are just in the moment, and outreach to communities as if it's just about the next 60 days, when the fact of the matter is that the relationships, the structural breakdown, the discrimination, racism, bigotry, all of that is really a part of the foundation of America. And so, I have to say, I have spent my entire career thinking about how do we as Black people, how do we as marginalized people, women, queer people, how do we build power, access it, and make change? And I really leaned into the idea that representation matters. And that one of my favorite quotes is actually from Congressman Barney Frank, who was the first out gay member of Congress. And he said that when we are not at the table, then we're on the menu. And if we don't have us at the table, then that is when so much goes awry. And so I have been working to try to diversify the people who hold office and who sit at these tables where decisions are being made every day that impact our lives. And what has been interesting about, say, the last 20 years And it's been about maybe 15 years ago now since I ran the Congressional Black Caucus's PAC. So I have been up close and personal to how the politics of race, and then more recently leading the gay movement's political arm, and sexual orientation, gender identity, have kind of played out in America. And it is striking to me that in 15 years, we are still dealing with the same problems, having the same conversations, even as we are starting to see a change in the diversification of the people who hold office. So what's nice about now, relative to 15 years ago, and by the way, this is all because of the Democrats. So I do need to give the Democratic Party credit where it's due. We have more Black women who are holding office now all around this country than ever before in history. At least over 100 Black women actually ran for Congress this current political cycle. We know that in terms of Democratic participation, it is Black women who show up and out in mass at higher rates as it relates to the electorate that supports Democrats. So we turn out in good numbers and we show up for the Democratic Party. At the same time, though, while we're seeing some of these gains in the representation changing, we're still dealing with the same issues. And so I really struggle with and have throughout this whole conversation around this cycle and the VP. And coming off of the heels of having a President Barack Obama as the first Black man in the White House, we knew that it was that we can't go backwards. We can't go backwards with regards to diversity. And the calls for having a Black woman on the ticket really were striking to me. One, because it matters. Representation is important. It's important that we have people who reflect the totality of the community holding jobs that affect our lives, because their life experience, surely their connections, being in tune to the people who are closest to the pain is important when you're trying to come up with policy ideas and solutions to have progress and move us forward. But the idea that just simply tokenizing and creating a space for somebody who is a Black woman as transformative is something we all really need to think deeply about. And I think that the Democrats have, in my 20 years being a Democratic operative, have really done a good job of creating an umbrella and a tent where we're welcome, right? Come on in, have some chicken, right? Like, we welcome. But that doesn't always mean that we've had power. And while we may have access to photo opportunities, that doesn't necessarily mean that our presence has transformed a whole lot. And so now that we're in this position where we hopefully will have the highest ranking Black woman in the land, in a pathway to then, herself assuming the role of presidency in the White House, the question for me, and what I challenge the party on all the time, is what difference will that make? Because representation is key and critical. But now that we have it, now that we got access to power, y'all, now that they heard our calls for put a Black woman on the ticket, what is going to be different, and what role will she play in being able to really tackle all of these structural issues that were mentioned before? How will her presence there then change the way that we do business as usual? So it's not just business as usual. And how will her presence as a Black woman and her connections to the community of Black women start to disrupt a lot of the neoliberalism that helped her to become who she is? These are all the questions that I think that all of us who are participating in these conversations, who are going to vote and going to support the Democratic Party, I hope, because we got to get rid of Donald Trump. And yes, I'm being extremely partisan because it's just where I come from. But how we then hold accountable the party, and how we then, from the outside, offer the type of support as well as the challenges necessary to help this sister who's going to have this role really be transformative in it, is what I think that we should always come back to and think about. Because it's easy to wag our fingers at and poke at, oh, well, the Democrats aren't doing this, that, and the other thing. But now that we've essentially got what we've wanted, we have the perhaps the greatest access to power and position of power as Black women, kind of on track. Now the question becomes, what are we going to do with this place? And I, do not want us to be satisfied with just having a spot anymore and a place at the table. I want us to start to disrupt the table and to really transform it.
Aisha Mills turning over the tables in the temple as a Democratic operative. I want to talk about two issues that in many ways are kind of places where for the Black community, the agendas put out both by Vice Presidential nominee Kamala Harris and by Presidential nominee Joe Biden are, way at the level of structural change of what is needed. And then where I think there's a lot of fears that are being held by the community about what can happen. So on the positive front, we are increasingly, it feels like every day there is a new study that shows us just how much something, Black people have always known, which is just how polluted our air is and what the health effects of that are. We talk, thankfully, a lot now. There's a national conversation about infant mortality and Black infant mortality and Black maternal mortality that is profoundly linked to excess temperatures and to air pollution. In a way that because air pollution has gone down since the economy was shut down, the rates of early, preterm births and infant mortality have plummeted. I mean, this is real, right? When we breathe this toxic air, it kills our babies. And Black and Brown Americans have been alarmed, concerned, and willing to organize and fight around environmental issues and climate change issues. And let us be very clear, because I've been digging into this data, it is white Americans who are holding us back on this. The image is of an environmentalist who's a white person, hiking. That is not who actually cares about climate change, right? The majority of white Americans are in more of the skeptical or dismissive camp. And it's Black and Brown Americans who are alarmed and concerned, according to research from Yale University. So thankfully, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have got both of them, in the primary, and then together now have really bold policies that would slow the impacts of climate change, create millions of new green jobs, clean up our air and water. It really is, I think in many ways, so much of what we need in this country. Where I think the community has some fears is on the question of how ambitious the criminal justice reform and policing reform will be. And so I think we should just talk about that and get that out there, knowing full well that Donald Trump is in the exact worst possible place on this issue, that he stopped the reforms that President Obama put into place, the consent decrees, that his rhetoric has furthered the sort of white supremacist activities, in and around the law enforcement apparatus, as well as private militias and vigilante justice. Let us be very clear that there is no comparing on the issues of our safety in our communities, Donald Trump and Joe Biden and the Democrats. But it is also important for us to be able to articulate as a community what it is that we want. And so I do want to ask anybody to really weigh in on this. This question of defunding the police, how does this fit into your vision of what the criminal justice or the criminal legal system needs to be and our relationship to it? And what do you think are some of the things that we need to say and decide about a vision around criminal justice reform to make this compelling and persuasive to the broader country?
Well, let me just take a stab at this really quickly, Heather, and then I'm really interested in what everyone else has to say here. I think, first of all, I think people have gotten caught up on the slogan, and I think most of the time that's motivated by bad faith. People know what defund the police actually means. Activists are operationalizing it all the time. It's a way of talking about budgets reflecting values and the like. But I think at the heart of what we need to push for is a shift of the frame, going back to my earlier comments. We cannot, in this election cycle, in light of what we have experienced, concede to a discussion about who's strong, who's soft on crime and who's not. We cannot cede to a frame or concede to a frame that insists on that law and order as the way to determine how one moves about with the question of criminal justice reform. I believe we need a broad public infrastructure of care, and begin to talk about that public infrastructure of care having three legs to its stool. One having to do with healthcare, the other having to do with education, and the other having to do with safety. What we're talking about is not law and order, we're talking about safety and security. We know our communities are over-policed, over-surveilled, and underprotected. And yet what we see is a response to our communities is just simply locking us up, right? In interesting, in very clear ways. And so part of what folks are scared of, because Vice President Biden has to own his role in making the criminal code what it is. You can damn near sneeze in the United States and break a law. And part of what folks are asking is that we need to decriminalize. And so part of what my colleague Naomi Mirakawa wrote an extraordinary book entitled How Liberals Built Prison America, the first civil right, How Liberals Built Prison America. And Joe Biden plays a central role in that story. Senator Harris has to be honest about her position as AG in California. And then they have to tell a story about how they've evolved, right? And so part of that evolution for me involves moving from law and order as a frame to safety and security and a broader public infrastructure of care. I want to hear that, but I should say this. I'm going to vote for the Democratic ticket because just like Aisha, we got to get Donald, as I would say, because I'm from Mississippi, we got to see the back of his head. I'm clear about that, right? But at the same time, the agenda is not to tinker around the edges. That's not going to save us. When Vice President Biden embraces a green agenda, but then says we can't get rid of fracking, my antenna go up, right? We got to continue to push along these issues. And I'll shut up. Now I want to hear everybody else. I just want to change the frame.
I want to mention something in that same framing, and push it even a little bit more. I agree with my brother, Dr. Glaude, about we cannot just get locked into slogans. We do too much sloganism in this country. Left versus right, conservative versus, all these slogans that just trap us and disable our ability to think deeper, think imaginatively, and really talk about what's going on. We have known for a while that certainly, whether it be the military or whether it be policing, we have a lot of funding going into a lot of different places that it ought not be going, and it's not serving the community. And not only just not serving the Black community, it's not even serving the poor white community, poor Latino community. One of the things I think we have to, and I hope you'll ask me a question eventually. I want to come back to poverty, but I want to deal with this issue. At the National Cathedral on June 14th, I preached a sermon that said America has to decide that accepting death is no longer an option. As a political mandate, as a political place of launching from, we have to start saying we're going to deal with the death measurement in every regressive racist piece of public policy, because every one of them has a death measurement. It has a DM on the DL, a death measurement on the down low. And we got to bring that death measurement out and deal with it. The next thing is, if we're serious about this, we can't, you remember in the country we used to say, take down, the old church said, don't take down to the devil. We can't take down. Like, we should, let's be honest.
Did I just freeze up?
I'm still on, I see. We can't take down. We have an election, we can't take down. We also can't, we have to go hard. We have to go hard. If we're gonna go hard on Trump and then get him out, we have to go hard on those who cannot win, but without our vote. Our protesting, our pushing cannot stop January 22nd of 2021. And then one of the last things is structurally and legal wise, if we're really going to deal with particularly death and policing, we have to have a federal law that prosecutes police for murder with life without the possibility of parole when you use the power of the state to kill innocent people. Because remember that murder right now is a state issue. And what has always been, whether from Squanah Chaney and Goodman being killed or Emmett Till, the perpetrators of death, police were involved in too, always knew if they didn't get prosecuted on the state level, they might get prosecuted on the federal level, but it was only a 5-year penalty. There has to be a serious federal penalty for using the power of the state and for killing somebody in my name. We got to start talking. When you murder somebody as a police, you are doing that in my name. You have power that you get from me, the citizenry, and you're the only person that with a gun and a piece of paper can come to my house and take my wife or my children out of that house, and I simply say, baby, I'll see you downtown. Anybody else, including everybody on this panel, if you tried to remove my family, you wouldn't do it. But if a police person comes with a gun and a piece of paper, that's an enormous amount of power you get from me. And so we cannot have a structure that simply stops prosecution at the state level. Last thing. Last thing I want to mention. You said something too about even when you were talking about the environmental issue. Mm-hmm. Civil rights are all of our organizations, even on the environmental piece. See, I'm one that believes we have to critique ourselves as well. So that's one of the things is we can't be around here taking money from polluters.
Uh-oh.
We can't be taking money. If we want to know about Donald Trump taxes, we better learn something about these Black organizations' money that they taking. You can't be taking money from polluters and not standing up to them, and then turn around and try to say you're against environmental injustice. You know, you can't do that. And then lastly, if you're serious about criminal justice, the truth of the matter is Kamala is not enough. And it's too much to ask of her. I don't care what politician, white politician, that tells me I'm with Black Lives Matter and when they get in office, I'm gonna change things. If you are not trying to get those 4 Black women who are leading the ticket elected in North Carolina, and the Black man in South Carolina, and a Black senator from Georgia, and a Black senator from Mississippi, all who could win if the Democratic Party would invest, and they're currently not doing it. We're not talking about it, because that tells me you're not even serious about changing the structure that will get us to police reform. Because you can't get to police reform without changing the United States Senate and the United States House. So if you are not deeply and heavily investing in what's happening in North Carolina, you have 4 Black women leading the ticket. They can't hardly raise a dime. Nobody's talking about 4 of them. One of them is running for Chief Justice. You have a Black man in South Carolina. You got a Black man in Mississippi. They don't even talk about him. He only lost by 2 percentage points last time, and with just 20% of the white vote and a sure Black vote, he could take Mississippi. That's Black Lives Matter. That's fundamental change. And if the party is not investing in them and when working to change the Senate, then you're not serious about really having policy, because you can't change policy unless you have not a reckoning, because a reckoning is one thing. To change policy, you got to have a reconstruction. Not just a reckoning. You got to have a reconstruction of who sits in those seats, and then you have to hold them accountable, and they can't get so happy to sit in the seat. They don't do what the agenda is necessary for Black people to be lifted, and thereby all other vulnerable people in the country.
Yes. And I just want to add to that. Thank you so much for that, Reverend Barber.
I just want to welcome our last panelist. I'm so sorry. She's arrived. Dr. Johnetta Cole, she's the chair and 7th president of the National Council of Negro Women, which is 2 million members. But she also was the first African-American woman president of Spelman and later president of Bennett College. Welcome, Dr. Cole. Thank you so much for being with us today. Oh, you're still muted.
So sorry to be so late. This is taking CPA time just too far. Colored people assembling time too far. Let the conversation continue. I will certainly come in, but my sister, Aisha, you wanted to say something.
Thank you.
Oh, well, first of all, it's just such an honor to be on this call with you, one of my longtime heroes. I did not get a chance to go to Spelman. I would have gone, but then you left literally like the year that I was thinking about going. It's a whole other conversation. But no, I just wanted to very briefly just put a fine point on what Reverend Barber was just saying, which he was alluding to the fact that all politics, y'all, at the end of the day are local. And people like, me and Eddie and Heather, who are on TV all the time, talking the talk, to some degree perpetuate the idea that we should only be paying attention to the presidential. And like sometimes there are sexy congressional races that matter too, but when you look at the money that is moving through politics, it is a multi-billion-dollar industry. At least $500 million go into political cycles at the federal level. But the truth is where there's opportunity for deep change, policy-wise, other just in practice, structurally, is at the local level. That is particularly true when it comes to policing and criminal justice reform for all the reasons that were just laid out. And if we are not paying attention to who is being elected as our prosecutor in our towns, shout out to Color of Change PAC for doing so much work around trying to replace people who are just prosecuting Black folk for no reason and throwing them in jail. But we've got to pay attention to those down ballot races, because those are the people who really have their finger on the pulse and the opportunity to make some of the changes that, let's be real, aren't going to happen overnight at the federal level. So God bless Nancy Pelosi, who moved the policing bill, which was probably the biggest thing that we have seen in our lifetime, that still doesn't go far enough, we all can agree to, but is transformative for the United States Congress. It moved out of the House. It ain't going anywhere in the Senate. It's highly unlikely that that's even going to get passed. Maybe that's something for Biden and Harris to pick up on. But again, we're talking still about a long struggle of time of trying to get a federal bill moved, let alone it go as far as it needs to go. But today, what we can do is we can absolutely focus on the locality of the politics that are right around us to make those changes. And it is Black women all around the country who are leading that charge too. So if there's anything I would say coming out of this as our call to action is do participate, vote in November, but vote all the way down the ballot, because that's where I think the politics really get personal for us and actually touch our day-to-day lives. And we got to participate there.
Heather, can I make
And
one
support those other candidates. Go ahead.
Can I make one qualification? Because my sister said something and I don't want anybody out there to miss. We say it will take a while. It takes a while because there's not a commitment. Right now, do you know it would only take 1 to 19% of poor and low wealth voters, 1 to 19%, that's all, who are already registered, don't have to register, but to mobilize them in 15 states, 1% in Michigan, 19% in North Carolina, so forth, to change the United States Senate. That's all. That's the data. We did a study for Columbia University. Voting is power unleashed. We have poor and low wealth people, but look at what you have. You have too often, and we're changing it. Some think for Biden came the other night and talked to over 1 million poor and low wealth people that joined us. We had 3 million that came online in June. But Dr. King said only Black people, poor white people, labor, and even welfare rights recipients could fundamentally change the structure. That prophecy is possible. It's probable. It's empirical. It's no longer just a pipe dream. In 15 states, if you just move 1 to 19% of the vote. Now, but that means then you got to speak to poor and low wealth people who make up 63 million of the 63 million of the voters that did not vote last time. Why do they not vote? People say they're apathetic. That's not true. The studies say they never hear their names. And you know what people talk about, middle class and wealthy. You don't hear, they never hear their names. They never hear their conditions. Transportation, can't get off work, voter suppression. Those are the three things. We can change at least two of them. That is them hearing their name, right? And that is transportation, and that is access. And we can break some of the, but my point is, you know, I talk with a lot of people, and they will say, particularly, and some blacks and some whites. I was talking to a black politician the other day. He says, well, you know, I really don't have time to work with hard to reach the voters that don't usually vote. I said, what do you mean you don't have time? That's why they don't vote, because you don't have time. What else the hell
Your
do you
job.
Exactly.
I'm sorry, Madam President. I mean, you're a politician. What else do you have time to do? Especially when you're in a safe black district where you're already going to win. All you got to do is run like you have competition, up that vote, put some pressure out there, be tough inside the party, because in Michigan it's 1%. In North Carolina it's 19% of poor level. In Florida it's 9%. In Michigan, Wisconsin, I'm through. In Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, Trump wins by about 80 to 100,000 votes. 2.1 million poor and low wealth people that were eligible to vote and could have voted, didn't vote, and many times weren't even talked to. And if they had, they shift the Senate. And then you have a House and a Senate in progressive Democratic hands. Then you push them, not in 100 days, but in the first 50 days to pass the kind of laws that we need passed.
All right,
Now,
Dr. Cole.
I don't know if you all have gone here yet, but we do know that Black women are the demographic in the United States of America who vote the most and vote most consistently for the Democratic Party. And so anybody running for anything up and down the ticket that is not speaking to the interests of Black women ought not to be elected. In my view, this is not about dividing Black women and Black men and folk of any kind of gender. This is about respecting the totality in our community. And the number of times when we Black women don't get our names called. We got to stop this. It never should have taken as long as it took for any kind of meaningful organizing around the brutal taking of Breonna Taylor's life.
Right, that's right.
We got to stop calling names unless we're going to call all of the names.
That's right, right.
Part of what I know my brother Rev was saying when he said we got to police ourselves, we got to speak the full truth, is that we've also got to call names of folk who may not be in the center of Black respectability. The number of Black, lesbian, gay, but most specifically trans people killed is just unimaginable.
Yes, indeed.
So just had to come in with that.
Please and thank you. And thank you, Dr. Cole. I know that there are a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask some of the folks from the team to answer some of the simple questions about links and where to find things. And then I want to invite people who have not seen that the Q&A is there to go ahead and offer a question. We don't have a lot of time left. I'm going to quickly grab some questions and have a little bit of a lightning round if it's possible. One thing that people have asked about is about the importance of structural democracy reform, the Electoral College, the filibuster, the Senate, really focusing on the legislative branch and how it functions. So who wants to take that question?
I think you're exactly right that those reforms have to happen, but in order to happen, you have to change the narrative and build power. And that's why one of the reasons we have done, I want people to know you can go to Voting is Power Unleashed at the Poor People's Campaign website. there's a study there that actually shows the power we have. I'm tired of being depressed now because I've seen the power that we have. And it's about organizing that power. And Dr. Cole is exactly right. And we have to organize it around issues. For instance, we have 27 million plus people who've now joined 87 million people who are uninsured or underinsured. The majority of them are women, and the majority of them are Black women. The majority of the essential workers are women and Black women. So the question people ask me, what difference does it make with having Senator Harris at the top of the ticket? I say it can make a difference if that brings all these other women in, if it brings them in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's going to bring them in is policy. When people start connecting their vote to their life, you will never have to convince them to vote again. When they actually say, if I vote and people get elected in the first 50 days, not 100, my life is going to change. In terms of healthcare, my life is going to change in terms of a living wage. My life is going to change in terms of stopping polluters. Then what happens is you draw more people in. The more people that come in, we can change the structures, the Senate and the House and the state legislatures. Then you can have a constitutional convention. Right now, you don't want to have a constitutional convention right now. That's the last thing you want to have, with the majority of these state legislatures being controlled by extremists. So we have to change the structure first, the political, and that's reconstruction. You have to reconstruct who's making the decision and then strategically decide which pieces of policy structure we need to do based on who we have in position to, in fact, bring that to conclusion.
Well, one thing that people are asking for is more of this conversation. I do think that our friends at BWA are going to send out an email to folks who registered for this conversation with some follow-up links. One of the most important things that people have asked is basically what can and should we do? And there will be resources and links in there. We've already gotten from Reverend Dr. Barber, the Moral Mondays link address. Say that again one more time for us.
It is just go to poorpeoplescampaign.org and you can get the moral justice platform. You can receive how to vote. You can see the thing on voting is power unleashed. All of it is right there, poorpeoplescampaign.org.
Great. Thank you. And I am going to pull in this question. Someone asked if this is recorded. It's going to be it is being recorded. It's going to be posted. Someone asked a question about health disparities, and I do think that we should talk about that because of the health crisis that we are experiencing right now on top of the pre-existing pandemic of racism in our economic and health system. So first of all, I want to invite people to go to the National Collaborative on Health Equity for more resources about what can be done around the social determinants of health. But I want to be very clear that, this virus is not discriminating. It is American society and capitalism that are discriminating, that have underinvested in the health infrastructure, that have allowed racism to continue in the way that we are treated, that have allowed us to be forced to work in dangerous ways, serving a broader economy that is not serving us, and that has allowed, frankly, for the administration and the Republicans in the Senate to take their foot off the gas on caring about this pandemic once it became clear who was being most affected by it, which is Indigenous people, Black people, low wealth people, and women. And so, that is very clear to me in terms of the stakes. But it's also true that the United States Senate has not acted on a pandemic response since the first CARES Act, and that the House passed 3 months ago a bill that would save our economic security for working class people, and that would be, helping to get this country more in shape around schools reopening, around the incredible fiscal problems that are happening in states and localities. And we can't, give them a pass. We can't just say, well, of course, the Republicans are not going to do anything. We do need to still put pressure on our senators around that issue, because
I just wanted to underline that really quickly, Heather, because we need to understand that the pain and suffering we're experiencing in this country right now is in part the result of a choice.
That's
These
right.
folk are choosing this. The food lines, what's happening in schools, what's happening with COVID, they made a choice, and the choice has been driven by greed. unadulterated greed. And we need to understand that this is not inevitable, what we're experiencing. This was not inevitable. It is a choice.
Hear, hear. And if I could add to that,
Please.
while we think almost immediately about our physical health, you know, and we've always been saying it, when white folk got a cold, Black folk got walking pneumonia. Well, this virus clearly is affecting our physical health. It is killing us, disproportionately killing us. But our mental health, our emotional well-being, because we are in not one pandemic, we're in multiple pandemics. And that means when a Black child who's old enough to have something in his hand that he can look at or she can look at, and that Black child sees the assault on the lives of Black people, we are messing with a whole generation of our people. And so we got to get a handle on this thing. Yes, our physical health. And once again, Black women disproportionately affected. Why should a Black woman die more in childbirth? Why? Why should Black children die more than white children? So clearly, when we talk about health, we are talking about the totality, our physical, our emotional, and yes, Brother Rev, I'm going to say it, our spiritual health, the three. And again, without any interest in being divisive, we've got to deal with the double jeopardy of systemic racism and systemic sexism.
Heather, I'm gonna let go ahead, my sister. I'll come after her. Go ahead. I saw you just cut your.
Go ahead, Aisha. We have 2 minutes left.
Well, no, so we only have 2 minutes left. Just the thing that I wanted to make sure that we were reminded of in this conversation, because we haven't talked a lot about it, is voter suppression. I'm just thinking about everything that you guys are saying about all of the, you know, the social determinants of health and all the things that we're experiencing with regards to disparities, et cetera. And thinking about conversations I have with my family. All my people are in South Carolina, and you know, they don't approach voting and civic engagement and democratic participation in a way that is so nuanced in details around all of these isms that we face and all the disparities that we face, so much as there's a feeling that there's kind of the right thing to do, which is why we should vote, or I'm bored and just not engaged, which is maybe why I didn't vote last time. And as we intellectualize everything that's happening to Black folk and affecting our communities, I want to just remind us all who are watching this today that the way we vote, because of COVID, because of just where we are, is going to look differently this cycle, in addition to the fact that we're trying to vote in the wake of economic, you know, collapse and pandemic, et cetera. If you haven't already, if your state requires you to request an absentee ballot so that you can vote, you need to do that. If you're mailing in ballots, you need to organize around how you're going to make sure that everybody you know gets them, fills them out, actually drops them in the mail or puts them in a drop box. Every state is different in terms of how we're able to vote this year. And it is going to be more complicated than ever before. And the truth is that for a lot of us, it's not the devil of the detail of the issues that motivate us to go stand in that line. Sometimes it is the pride with a Barack Obama of seeing ourselves reflected back. So hopefully Kamala Harris on the ticket will jazz us up. But if anything, I think that because there's so much noise going on right now, if we could inspire everyone around us, either organizationally, in our own families, through our friend groups, our social networks, you know, fraternities, sororities, whatever it is, to vote, to participate this cycle. And if for no other reason, to have the righteous indignation to do it, even though they don't want us to. Because we know that everything that Donald Trump and the right are doing right now is attempting to make it more complicated for us to cast our ballots and participate. And so I think that if we can all leave here being indignant in a way that says we're going to show up, vote, participate, and go through all the motions, even though it's hard, because just if no other reason is because they don't want us to, then we're going to win.
Thank you. I want to give 2 resources because people are asking for them on that point. One is vote.org to figure out what your early voting situation is, all of that. The other is, it is not, we can still vote in person. And I want to be clear, I'm planning to vote in person. I'm planning to put my face shield on, my mask, my gloves, and I'm going to go vote in person. And my husband is signing up to be a poll worker. And you can do that through Power to the Polls, because Democrats are possibly losing an advantage by focusing so much on vote by mail with all that's going on with the Postal Service and not having the security of when and how our votes will be counted. And I want to make it clear that we can still vote in person. And obviously early voting allows you to do it in a way where you won't be in a crowd. Dr. Barber, I know you wanted to say something.
I'm going to say it real quick. First of all, I'm glad that you said that, because this must be our South Africa moment. Mm-hmm. Remember those lines? The only difference is we put on the mask and we put on the gloves. But we vote. We must be scared to life. All of this death must scare us to life. All of this death must scare us to life. And we must vote issues, because it can't just be history. We, as Dr. Cole said, we are dying. Secondly, if we do it, change comes. The only southern state that threw out a Republican governor in the last year in off-year election was Kentucky. You know how it happened? When we organized people in the hood and in the holler and turned 5 states that went for Trump the other way. I'm talking about Black folk and white people. And we started with systemic racism as the entry point in the hollers, in Harlan County, in 90% white. We showed them how systemic racism has targeted us and killing them too. And we are ready to have that conversation. And then they brought together people. So that is possible. And the last thing is, if we're going to McConnell, for instance, we got to make these connections, because of fusion politics is the way out. It always has been. You got to have people who understand what Dr. Cole's student says. She's now PhD in public health. She's organized a panel on this. She's got one from Drexel, one from Harvard. She happens to be my daughter, and USLA. And those 3 Black women, and I need to tell y'all this, and I'm through, they had to shut down some Black caucus members who didn't want to listen to them, males. When they came in the room, we called them together. I don't pull no punches, y'all. I'm too old to pull punches. When they said, listen, it's not just Trump ineptitude. That this virus is showing us that systemic poverty and systemic racism are matters of national security. And the virus has strength because of the fissures that you all have not fixed, that we've not fixed as a nation prior to COVID. The virus lives in those fissures. And that's why they challenged the CARES Act that everybody voted for, but 83% of that money went to corporations and banks. 83% of that money went to corporations and banks. And so we've got work to do. We have to do it on issues and on history. We have to be scared to life because of all this death. And lastly, if we're going to call Breonna Taylor's name, there's no reason why Black folk should not be organizing with white folk to get rid of McConnell. And if Democrats aren't pushing to take McConnell out, they aren't serious about us yet. Now, we're going to vote for him because we know we got to do. Because here's the hook. The Attorney General that refuses to prosecute the police was McConnell's lawyer. That's and he's Black. That's why a conversation about systemic racism can't just be about white folk. But you can be an enabler of racism, Black, and we've got some of them. That Attorney General, Tim Scott, and some others. And I'm not saying that because I don't like them. I'm saying look at the policies. And if they tell, one of them told me, he said, well, I'm not so-and-so. I said, well, you may not be a Tea Partier. You may say that, but you have to be at least a dummy. He said, well, why do you call me a dummy? Because every ventriloquist can find a good dummy. Ventriloquist can find somebody to put his hand up their back and cause them to speak. And I'm not talking personal, because racism for me is never about name calling, as Ibram Kendi said. I don't want to talk about that, who called me the N-word. You show me your policies, and I'll tell you if you're a racist. Even if you never call me the N-word or never say a racist thing to one, because it's the disparate treatment in the policy. And if we're gonna call names, that Black Attorney General was put there by McConnell. So if folk are serious about dealing with Breonna Taylor and want a reform bill, all hands should be on deck. Tell them, Sister Mill, I said this, all hands should be on deck. And Kentucky is winnable if they call poor people to the polls of every race, creed, and color, because they just did it in 2018 with the governorship.
All right, everybody.
All
We
right.
have gone way over time, but of course we have. These are an incredible set of people. This conversation will be on YouTube. Thank you. I want to kick it back to Gwen to take us home.
Thank you, panel. You all were riveting and just as royal as I said you were going to be in the beginning. It was just really, really wonderful. And as Aisha would said, we should all be indignant. We all need to get out the vote. We all need to do what we need to do, whether it's poll watching or going out and making this happen, because it's on us. We matter. And we need to start acting like it. And everyone around us needs to do the same. I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank our sponsor, AARP, our national collaborating organizations. You can go online and look and see what they're doing. We're going to be in contact with everyone who registered for this evening. I, like you, Heather, plan to go out and vote in person just because that's my tradition. But anyone who's going to vote by mail, I just want to remind you, don't forget to sign your ballot. Don't give anybody an excuse for your voice not being heard. So thank you to the board of directors and everyone who participated in this today. The time just flew by. I don't want it to end, but I just want to thank you all for being a part of this, and love to all of you. Blessings, and let's make this happen on November 3rd.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Look out for the email, ways to take action.
To everyone.
Forward
Take care,
together.
everybody.
Let's do it.